One might argue that if the Alpha King had simply stayed in his own bed, like a sensible monarch, he'd never have watched a waitress walk into a room full of drawn blades and lose whatever it was he'd been using, up until that night, in place of a heart. But then again, if the roadhouse at Blackpine had spent 2 coppers on a door that actually locked, there'd have been no drawn blades for her to walk into. And if the king's own tax writers had done their work honestly, along the Iron Way, Blackpine would have had the coin to spare for the door. So really, if one followed the thread back knot by knot, the whole ruinous business was the king's fault, all of it, every last part. Not that anyone in the common room of the Blackpine Roadhouse knew there was a king among them. That was rather the point of the 2 travelers in the corner, cloaked like a horse trader and his hired man, nursing ale they hadn't touched, and watching the room the way careful men watch weather. Sorrel watched no one. That was rather the point of her. She had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being furniture. A waitress at a weighhouse on a trade road learned it, or she learned nothing. How to move so that eyes slid off her, how to set a bowl down at a man's elbow without ever once giving him a face to remember. She was tall for it, which didn't help, and quiet for it, which did. She kept her hair scraped back, her sleeves down past the wrist in all weathers, and her voice to the fewest words a body could survive on. Stew or the pie, ale or the cider, mind the step. In 3 years, she had given the road nothing of herself, and the road, being a fair trader, had given her nothing back. She counted this a good arrangement. The room was full and loud and warm, which was how the trouble got so far before anyone smelled it. Drovers down from the high pastures, 2 families waiting out the rain, a card game in the back gone friendly mean over coppers. Tam, the youngest of Corvin's servers, ferried tankards with his ears pink from a joke he didn't understand. Willa laughed at the bar. It was for the length of one held breath, an ordinary night. Then the door that didn't lock came open on the wind, and 3 men came in with it. Sorrel knew what they were before she'd finished turning. Everyone did. It was in the way the warmth went out of the room ahead of them, the way the drovers' wolves lowered their eyes without deciding to, the animal underneath, the man reading the animal underneath the men, and voting, unanimously and instantly, to be somewhere else. Rogues, packless, the kind the road coughed up when a season went bad. Wolves who'd been cast out or run off and found that the far side of loyalty was a great deal of freedom and very little to eat. They came in, wearing the road's grime, and that particular ready looseness that meant violence had stopped being a last resort for them some time ago. The big one in front had a bounty hunter's iron manacle swinging from one fist, and a look that was already searching faces. "We're owed a man," he said, to the room in general. "Pleasant as you please. Ran this way 3 nights back. Ranald. Calls himself. Skinny. Lies. Somebody here's fed him." His pale eyes went round the room and found, of all people, Tam, because Tam was the only soul in the place young enough and green enough to have gone still as a struck rabbit, instead of blank as a wall. "You," the rogue said, and smiled. "You've a guilty little face." "He doesn't know anything," said Willa, too fast, from the bar, and that was the wrong thing, because now the rogue had 2 faces to enjoy. He crossed to Tam without hurry. The manacle came up and hooked almost gently into the boy's collar, and the boy made a sound. One of the others drifted to put his back to the door. The third let a knife fall open in his hand, just to watch the light run down it. And the room did what rooms do. It leaned away. 40 people found something to study in the grain of the tables. The 2 cloaked travelers in the corner went very still, and the younger of them, the one who wore his cloak like a costume rather than a habit, began slowly to rise, and the older gripped his arm at the wrist and did not let go, because whatever those 2 were, they were not here to be seen, and a scene was the one thing they could not afford. So there was no one at all between the boy and the men who'd already decided how the night was going to go, except that, at the bar, a waitress set down her tray. She did it without any sound to it. She simply stopped being furniture, which was so strange a thing for the furniture to do that the few who noticed forgot to breathe. She stepped out from behind the bar, and she did not go to the door, which was where every sane instinct in the building was straining, every wolf in the place wanting nothing on this earth, but away she turned the other way. She walked, unhurried, into the middle of the room, straight down the open lane of floor toward the three armed rogues, and the boy hanging off the end of an iron chain, toward the exact center of the only thing worth running from. In the corner, the younger traveler stopped fighting the hand on his arm. He had gone completely motionless, and his eyes, which had been flat and gray and tired all night, had come open wide and bright and fixed on the waitress crossing the floor, as though the whole rest of the world had quietly been carried out of the room while he wasn't looking. The rogue with the chain heard her boots at last. He turned, dragging the boy around with him, and looked at the plain, tall woman walking into his blade, with no weapon in her hands and no fear anywhere on her. And for the first time all night, something crossed his face that wasn't hunger. "That," he said slowly, "is a bad idea, love." Sorrel didn't stop. She came on until she was close enough to touch the iron, close enough that the knife man on the flank could have opened her from hip to shoulder before she drew a second breath, and she looked at the big rogue with those careful, giving-nothing eyes, and she opened her mouth to say the first full sentence she had spoken to a stranger in 3 years. "Let go of the boy," Sorrel said, "and I'll tell you where Ranald went." It was not what anyone expected, least of all the rogue. He had braced for a scream, or a plea, or a fool swing, and instead, a waitress was offering him a trade in a voice with no wobble in it at all. It threw him half a heartbeat off his rhythm, which, as it happened, was the entire point, though only 2 people in the room understood that yet, and one of them was her. "Where?" he said. "Not while you're wearing him." She nodded at the chain. "I don't bargain with a knife at a child. Put him down and step back 1 pace, and you'll have your man by morning. Keep hold of him, and you'll have nothing and a very long night." He wasn't a clever creature, but he was a greedy one, and greed will do a clever thing now and then, by accident. He weighed the plain woman, found no threat in her he could name, and decided a wayhouse mouse was cheaper to indulge than to gut. He opened his fist. Tam dropped, scrambled, fled behind the bar into Willa's arms. And the moment the boy was clear, the moment the chain swung loose, and the big man's weight settled back onto his heels, for that one promised pace, Sorrel moved. Afterward, no one at Blackpine could agree on what they'd seen, because it was over before their eyes caught up to it. She stepped inside the reach of the arm, not away from it, elbow to the throat, heel to the arch of the foot, something quick and technical with the iron that ended with the manacle locked round his wrist, and the free end whipped over a roof post. The knife man lunged and met a boot that folded him around it. The third had the sense the gods gave a door and simply ran. 10 seconds, tray to silence, and the most feared thing in the room hung wheezing from a post by its own chain, while the waitress stepped back toward the quiet, trying to be furniture again before anyone could fix her in place. She very nearly managed it. But, in the corner, the younger traveler was on his feet, and this time the hand at his wrist had let him go, because even its owner had run out of reasons to stop him. He crossed the room, not hurrying. Men who have never needed to hurry rarely learn how, and the crowd peeled out of his way without knowing why. He stopped in front of Sorrel, close, and pushed back his hood. She didn't know the face. That was the mercy of a life at the frayed edge of a kingdom. She'd never stood in any hall to see the man on the coin. But she knew what he was. The instant the hood came down, because the air changed around him the way it had around the rogues, only inverted. Not the room voting to flee, but every wolf in it, hers included, coming to silent attention beneath the skin. An alpha, not a road alpha, not a pack second, the kind the word had been invented for. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice low and unhurried, with absurdly a thread of amusement in it, as though she'd done something charming rather than something that had emptied a room of its air. She looked down. The knife man's blade had opened a thin line along her forearm. Through the sleeve, she never rolled. She hadn't felt it. "It's nothing," she said. "It is not nothing. It's my night's entertainment, wounded." He studied her, and the gray eyes that had been so tired had a light behind them now that made her want to step backward into the crowd and keep going until she reached another country. "Who taught you to do that?" "No one. I got lucky." "You got lucky," he repeated, in the tone of a man being lied to and enjoying it enormously. 3 times, in a row, in 10 seconds. Behind him, the older traveler had come up quiet, and the moment his face caught the lamplight, a drover near the door made a small, strangled noise and went to one knee, and then another did, and the truth went through the room like cold water through cloth, because the older man was known, his face rode on the king's own writs. And, if that was the king's beta in a trader's cloak, then the hooded man, leaning in toward the waitress, as though she were the only lit thing in a dark house, was Sorrel's stomach dropped through the floor. She had just cracked a man's foot and chained him to a post and told the Alpha King of all Vale to his face, and without one word of deference, that she'd gotten lucky. Every rule she'd survived by for 3 years said the same thing: get small, get quiet, get gone. She looked for the door. She looked for the furniture-shaped nothing. She'd been an hour ago and could not find her way back into it because he was watching her look for it, and worse, he understood what she was doing. She could see that he did. The Beta Osric, though she didn't have the name yet, said, low and warning at the king's shoulder, "Torin." Just that, a whole argument folded into a name. The king didn't seem to hear it. He looked at the plain, tall waitress with the bleeding arm who'd walked toward the one thing every other wolf in the room had run from, and something moved across his face that his beta had served beside him for 11 years, and had never once seen there, and would not, afterward, in the long bad weeks that followed, be able to explain to a single soul who asked. "There you are," the Alpha King said quietly, as though he'd been looking for her a very long time. And then he did the one thing that no law of Vielle, no counselor of his court, and least of all his own beta, could ever account for. He left. That was all. He looked at her as though she were the answer to a question he'd forgotten he was asking. He said his 3 strange words. And then he said a gold crown, in a house where a good week turned coppers, on the nearest table, told the room to see to the boy and the wounded girl's arm. He did not take the chained rogue. He did not take her name. He did not, as a king within his rights, and half his court would have expected, take her head for laying hands on violence in his presence, and speaking to him like something scraped off a boot. He simply went and left the whole common room of black pine, sitting in the wreckage of the strangest hour of their lives, staring at a gold coin and a plain woman who was already, desperately trying to disappear. She did not sleep. She lay in the narrow room under the eaves that Corvin let her keep, and she pressed the heel of her hand to the clean-wrapped cut on her arm until it hurt, and she called herself every kind of fool the road had a word for 3 years. 3 years of being no one, of being careful, of keeping her sleeves down and her past folded up small and buried where no one would ever have reason to dig, and she'd thrown it all onto the floor of a common room in 10 seconds because a boy had made a frightened sound. She knew better. She, of all people, knew exactly better. And underneath the fear, humming where she refused to look at it, was the other thing, the worst thing. The way the air had changed when the Alpha turned toward her. The pull of it, low in her chest, like a hand closing around a rope she hadn't known was tied to her. "There you are," as if he'd felt it too. She turned that over and over, and got nothing useful from it, and filed it, with grim determination, under too little sleep, and never again. Morning was worse, because morning brought company. "He's not going to remember," Tam offered, hovering in her doorway with 2 others crowded behind him, all of them the particular gray color of young people who have stayed up all night deciding a thing is fine. "A king. He sees 100 taverns. He won't. He left a gold crown. Tam, said Willa, elbowing in. Men forget the places they spend coppers. Nobody forgets where they left gold. Best case, Tam pressed on valiantly. He thinks she's clever and lets it. Best case, Willa said, flatly. He never thinks of her again, and that's a coin's odds at best. She crouched to Sorrel's level, and her voice gentled in a way that was somehow more frightening than the fear. Sorrel, what were you? Before here. Because whatever you did last night, a waitress can't do it, and if the king works that out before you're long gone, plain and quiet won't save you, and neither will any of us. What were you? Sorrel looked at the three worried faces and felt the old buried thing shift in its shallow grave. She had never told them. That had been the whole architecture of the last 3 years, that no one, not Tam, not Willa, not even Corvin, who'd taken her half-starved off the Iron Way and asked no questions, would ever have a true answer to give if a king's man came asking. A servant, she said, which was a word doing an enormous amount of work. In a hard house, you learn things. Nobody believed her. Mercifully, nobody pushed, because at that moment, boots came up the stair, 2 at a time, and Corvin filled the doorway, and one look at the roadhouse keeper's face emptied the room of everything but dread. He was a broad, grizzled, watchful man, Corvin, gone gray at the temple and easy with his hands. And in 3 years Sorrel had seen him unsettled, exactly, never. He looked unsettled now. He looked, in fact, afraid. And something else underneath it, something she was too frightened to read properly and would spend a great deal of the coming weeks wishing she had. There are riders in the yard, he said, vile colors. Come at first light, up from Thornhall, which is a hard 2 days, which means they turned for here, the moment the king got home and didn't stop to sleep. He wet his lips. They're asking for the waitress with the gray eyes, by description. Not by crime. Not by crime, Willa repeated, seizing on it. Then it's not an arrest. That's mercy. It is not an arrest, Corvin agreed slowly, and his gaze settled on Sorrel, with an expression she couldn't parse. Weighing her the way a man weighs something he is deciding what to do with. The king requests that she come to Thornhall as his guest. There's a horse for her, kindness in every word of it. He crossed the little room and to her surprise took both her cold hands in his big warm ones, and for one moment the fear on his face looked almost like grief. You don't have to go, girl, he said, low and strange and urgent. Whatever this is, whatever he thinks he saw, you say the word, and I'll get you off the back road tonight, and no king's rider will ever find you. Do you understand me? Don't go to that house. And Sorrel, who had survived 3 years by trusting exactly one man on the whole of the Iron Way, looked into the frightened, insistent face of the person who'd saved her life and could not for the life of her work out why the pull in her chest. That low, taut, unaccountable rope had just gone tight as a drawn bowstring. With quiet and total certainty, toward Thornhall. Thornhall was not what she braced for, which was itself a kind of cruelty, because it is easier to keep your feet in a place that hates you cleanly. She'd expected a cell, or a courtroom, or at the very least a great many spears. Instead, they gave her a bath, and a room with a window, and a supper she didn't eat, and left her overnight to imagine every worse thing a king might be saving for the morning. By the time the summons came, she'd have almost preferred the spears. They brought her, not to a dungeon, but to a hall, a long, cold, beautiful room, with a fire at one end, too far from anything to warm it, and perhaps 30 of the king's people arranged down its length in the particular stillness of a court that has been told something interesting is about to happen and intends to enjoy it. Sorrel walked the length of that floor with every eye on her sleeves and her plainness and her road-worn boots, and she understood, with the clarity of long practice, that she was being displayed. The only question was, what for? Torrin lounged at the head of it in a chair he was too restless, for one boot hooked over the arm, looking for all the world like a man who'd wandered into his own throne room by accident and decided to stay for the entertainment. He brightened when he saw her, the way no king should ever brighten at anything, and beside him Osric's jaw did something complicated. "There she is," Torrin announced, to the room delighted. "My roadhouse marvel. Captain Renwick was just telling me it's impossible." A broad, iron-gray man, at the king's right, the guard captain, she'd learn, and a man who wore his disapproval like a second cloak, inclined his head stiffly. "I said, Majesty, that a tavern girl cannot have disarmed 3 armed rogues, because tavern girls cannot do that. It is not disapproval, it is arithmetic, and yet—" Torrin's gray eyes came to rest on Sorrel, bright and unhurried and entirely too knowing. "Show the captain his arithmetic is wrong, would you? He so rarely gets to be." She said nothing. Nothing had kept her alive for 3 years. She saw no reason to abandon a good policy. Now, nothing to say. The king sighed happily, as though her silence were a gift he'd been hoping for. "Do you know, that's the 3rd time you've refused to explain yourself to me, and I find I like it more each time. Everyone in this room explains themselves to me, constantly, unbidden, at length. It's exhausting." He swung his boot down off the chair and stood, and the idle amusement did not leave his face, but something underneath it sharpened, and the court leaned in. "So I've decided to stop asking. Sorrel of Blackpine. That is the name, isn't it? The one you didn't give me. I am appointing you to my personal shield." The hall made a sound. Renwick made a louder one. "Majesty." A woman walked toward the blades in a room where 40 of my subjects walked away, Torrin said. And though he said it lightly, the lightness had gone thin over something with an edge. "I have a great many men paid handsomely to stand between me and the dark, Captain, and I watched every one of them, that night, calculate the odds and sit down." She didn't calculate anything. She just went. He looked at Sorrel. "I should like to keep a person like that close. Call it a whim. My whims are, I'm told, law." And there it was. The trap. Laid down so gently and so publicly that she felt it close before she'd finished seeing it. Refuse. And she spat a king's honor back in his face before his whole court, which no woman with anything to hide could do, without inviting exactly the scrutiny she'd crossed a kingdom to avoid. Why would a waitress turn down the safest post in Vielle, unless she had reason to fear being looked at? Except, and she was bound to Thornhall, roofed and watched and named, her sleeves one bad afternoon from betraying her. The road she'd always kept at her back, now a 2-day ride away behind a wall of the king's own men. There was no third door. He had built the room without one. She had time, in the space of a single breath, to admire it. It was good work, better than good. It was the work of a man who understood people the way she understood a room full of strangers, who had read her whole history of hiding in the 10 seconds it took her to cross a common room floor, and then built a cage from the one bar she could never bring herself to bend, which was her own need not to be looked at too closely. Kings were supposed to be stupid. That was nearly the first article of faith on the Iron Way. Corvin had said it 100 times over 100 suppers. The crown's too comfortable to think. Girl, that's the whole trouble with it. But this one thought entirely too much, and had turned the whole cold weight of it, for reasons she could not begin to fathom, onto her people. "We'll say," she managed low, "that you've lost your reason, a stranger, a woman off a trade road, at your back with a blade." "People say I lost my reason years ago," Torrin said cheerfully. "It's rather freeing. Say yes, Sorrel." She looked at him and understood that he knew there was no answer she could give but the one he wanted, knew she knew it, and was watching her arrive at it, with the open enjoyment of a man who has set a puzzle he's certain of. She hated that. She hated, more, the low, tight pull under her ribs that had wanted to say yes before her mind caught up, that had been pulling toward this cold, beautiful room since a horse first turned toward Thornhall. "Yes," she said. "Majesty," the court exhaled. Renwick looked as though he'd bitten something. Torrin only smiled, and something in the smile was almost gentle, and he stepped down, and near enough that the next words were for her alone, pitched under the hum of the dispersing hall. "You can stop hunting the door," he murmured. "There isn't one, and you're clever enough to have found it if there were. But hear me, since we're to be honest with each other now and again." The idleness was entirely gone from his voice. "Whatever it is you left on that road, whatever put those calluses on your hands, and that guard behind your eyes, it is safer standing at my back than it ever was hiding in Corvin's kitchen. I don't need to know what it is." His gray gaze held hers, and dropped deliberate to the sleeve over her scarred forearm, and came back up. "I only need to know that I'm right about you, and Sorrel, I'm always right about you." The king's guard did not want her, which was the most reasonable thing about the whole arrangement. They showed it in the small ways. Men show a thing they can't say aloud to a king's whim. A training yard that went quiet when she entered it. A rack of practice blades that turned out to be all splintered when she reached for one. A rota that somehow always put her watches back to back with the ones nobody wanted. Sorrel took all of it the way she took weather. She'd learned long ago that the surest way to make men stop testing you is to pass every test so plainly that failing you becomes more work than accepting you, and she set about it with the patient, unbothered competence of a woman who has genuinely nothing left to prove to anyone. It took 9 days. It might have taken longer, but on the 9th day, Renwick, who was not a cruel man, so much as an insulted one, decided to settle the arithmetic himself and put his best yard fighter against her in front of the whole watch, ostensibly to assess the king's shield. The best yard fighter was a slab of a man named, for none of the reasons that mattered now, and he came at her the way big, confident men come at tall, quiet women, and it was over rather faster than anyone wanted, and considerably more gently than she was entitled to. She could have hurt him. She let him keep his pride instead, and merely made it impossible, 3 times running, for him to touch her, until the watching guards had gone from smirking to silent, to at last, the grudging low murmur of men, recalibrating a thing they'd been sure of. Renwick watched with his arms folded and his face like a shut gate, and when it was done he unfolded them and said, "Where?" in a voice gone careful, and Sorrel gave him the same answer she gave everyone, which was none, and something in the captain's hard face eased half a degree toward respect he did not want to feel. 9 days, Renwick said, half to himself, watching the big man climb up off the sand a 3rd time. "You could have finished that, the first hour, and had every man here fear you by supper. You let him keep his feet 9 days instead. Why?" "Because I have to work here too," Sorrel said, and the captain's shut gate cracked another degree, because it was the answer of a person who meant to stay, and Renwick had been braced from the start for a king's whim who'd bolt the first hard week and leave him to sweep up the pieces. It did not make him like her, it made him, for the first time, take her seriously, which was worth a great deal more. Torin, of course, was watching from a window. Torin, she was fast learning, was always watching from somewhere, generally from exactly the spot that let him arrive, as though by accident the moment a thing became interesting. "You could have broken his arm," he observed, falling into step beside her as she left the yard, uninvited the way he did everything. "I could have. You didn't. He has to work tomorrow." She kept walking. He kept pace. It was, she'd found, entirely impossible to outwalk a man who had never once in his life been in a hurry. "You know what I think? He didn't wait, because he never did. I think you spend an extraordinary amount of effort making yourself smaller than you are, and I think it costs you something, and I think," here he ducked ahead and turned, walking backward now, so he could watch her face, which was maddening, "you've forgotten it's a choice. Come, I want to show you something, and I want you to tell me the truth about it, which no one else in this building will." The something was the watchbook. He'd had it fetched to a small, warm, cluttered room that was clearly his, and clearly forbidden, all maps and half-drunk cups, and a fire that actually reached, and he dropped the great ledger in front of her and said, without preamble, "My guard is either very unlucky or someone is stealing from me, and Renwick swears it's luck. and Renwick is honest. So I don't trust his answer, because honest men are the easiest ones to walk past. You've spent your life watching a room from the edge of it, so watch this one. Tell me what's wrong. And here was the thing she had not expected, the thing that undid 9 days of careful distance. In an hour, he meant it. There were no platitudes, no royal performance, no waiting for her to say the flattering thing. He pulled a second chair to the ledger and rolled his sleeves, and bent over the pages beside her, close enough that she could smell wood smoke and cold air and the warm animal underneath. And he actually listened, and when she found the first snag, a supply of lamp oil, signed out twice for the same night by 2 hands that shouldn't have crossed. He went still and quiet and sharp, in a way the idle court-torin never was, and she understood all at once that the idle court-torin was a coat he wore, and that this, the still one, the one who caught a thing the instant she pointed at it, was the man underneath the performance, and that almost nobody was ever allowed to see him. It should have made him less dangerous to her, that glimpse under the coat. It did precisely the opposite. The idle king she could have guarded and gone home from. No one ever ruined their life over a coat. But the still one bent over a ledger past midnight, because a door in his house stood open, and his own tired soldiers were paying for it, had a gravity she had not thought to brace against, and she felt herself lean toward it the way a cold thing leans toward a fire before she caught the lean and despised it. She had come to Thornhall to become no one. Instead, she sat in a forbidden little room, letting a king show her the one face he showed the world, and wanted, to her genuine disgust, to be shown more. "There's another," she said, before she could stop herself, and he said, "Where?" in a voice with nothing lazy left in it, and she leaned across him to turn back 3 leaves, and he turned his head at the same moment, and they were suddenly very close over the page, close enough that the low tight rope under her ribs pulled hard, and she watched his eyes drop to her mouth and come back up, and neither of them moved for one long, unlawful breath. Then she looked down at the ledger, and it saved them both. "There," she said unsteadily, and pointed. "The gate rotations. Someone's been leaving the east postern thin 1 night in every 9. Always the 9th. Always the same names off it." She frowned at the neat, treacherous column. The guard in her fully awake now, the pull forgotten in the older, colder thrill of a wrongness caught. "That's not luck, Majesty. That's a door. Someone's holding open on purpose on a schedule." Torin looked at the column, and then at her, and the warmth went out of the room a little. "The 9th, he said softly. "That's tomorrow. They should not have gone up onto the east wall themselves." Sorrel said so, plainly, twice, and was overruled both times by a king who had apparently decided that the fastest way to catch a thing holding a door open was to stand in the door and be catchable, which was either the bravest or the stupidest security philosophy she'd ever encountered, and she'd served under both kinds of men. "If someone means to use that postern tonight," Torin reasoned, in the maddening tone of a man explaining the obvious, "then someone must be worth using it for. I am generally the most worth it thing in the building. Ergo?" He spread his hands. "Bait catches more than a locked door ever did. Bait dies more too, not with you up here." He said it lightly, but there was something under it, some flat certainty, and it snagged at her the way the ledger had. He was not nearly frightened enough. She'd stood 100 watches beside men waiting for violence, and every one of them had carried the particular held-breath stillness of not knowing if they'd see morning. Torin carried none of it. He leaned in an embrasure watching the dark yard as though it were a mildly diverting play, and Sorrel, watching him, felt the first cold finger of a suspicion she couldn't yet name. So they waited, and the dark came down thick over Thornhall, and the fortress settled into its night shapes around them. Torin, who could not, it seemed, hold his tongue for the length of a full watch, filled the waiting with a low idle stream of nonsense. The failings of his counsel, the correct and much disputed way to ruin a good horse, a long and frankly libelous account of Captain Renwick's private opinion of her, until she understood that he was doing it on purpose. That the nonsense was a kind of blanket he was holding over the both of them. And that a man who tells jokes on a wall while he waits for killers to come up, it is either a fool or a man who has waited on a great many walls for a great many killers and learned that the loose, easy voice is the only thing that keeps the hands loose and easy too. She was no longer at all certain which he was. "You should be afraid," she told him very quietly. "I know," he agreed, and smiled out into the dark, and told her another joke. They came at the turn of the 9th hour, quiet as the schedule promised. She heard them before she saw them, not the scrape of a careless boot, but the wrongness of the yard's own sounds gone missing, the small night noises of a working fortress falling silent in a spreading patch, the way a pond goes still around something moving under it. She put her hand flat on the king's chest and pressed him back off the embrasure without a word, and for once he obeyed without one. 4 of them came over the thin-held postern and up the wall stair, and they came like men who knew the ground, knew which step gave, knew where the torch brackets left a blind, knew above all exactly where on the wall the king would be, which no outside enemy could have known. That single fact landed in Sorrel even as she moved. "These are ours." Then there was no more room for thinking. She took the stairhead, because a stair is a gift to one defender, and a curse to 4 attackers, and she made them come to her one and a bad, 2 at a time. The first she turned into the wall and put down. The second was better, quick and trained, and they traded 3 hard passes in the dark before she found the opening and closed it. The man folded with a grunt and did not rise. For half a breath the stairhead was hers and empty, and some foolish young part of her thought it might be as easy as that. It was not as easy as that. It never was. The third got past her reach toward the king, and she heard Torrin move behind her. Heard, to her fury, the ring of a blade she hadn't known he was carrying, and the short competent sounds of a man who could, it turned out, handle himself perfectly well, and had let her believe otherwise, for reasons she'd deal with later. And then the fourth came low and fast, and she took his blade along the ribs rather than her throat, hissed, spun, and brought him down under her knee, with his arm wrenched up behind him and his masked face pressed to the cold stone. Silence crashed back. Her side was on fire. Somewhere below, the missing night sounds crept back one by one. The king stood over the third man with his ridiculous secret blade dark to the hilt, breathing hard, entirely unsurprised. And that, the unsurprised, was the thing she'd come back to. "You're welcome," she said, when she had the breath to spare for it. He didn't answer at once. He was looking at the 2 men she'd put down, and the one he'd taken himself, and there was no fear anywhere in his face, and no shock, either, only a kind of grim, weary arithmetic. A man totting up a sum he had clearly added several times before. "This isn't the first," she said. It was not a question. Something moved behind his eyes, there and gone, before she could catch it. "Bind those ribs before you bleed on my wall," he said gently, which was not an answer, and Sorrel noted, with the cold and never quite sleeping part of her that had kept her alive longer than her softer parts ever had, that it was the second time in a fortnight this man had handed her care in the exact place where the truth should have gone. She was keeping a list. It had 2 lines on it now, and both of them were his, and she did not like at all the shape they were starting to make, that the list could wait. First, she wanted a face. She dug her knee harder into the man beneath her, got her fingers into the wrapped cloth over his features and tore it down. She knew him, not from the road, not from some far-off other life. She knew him from 9 days of splintered practice blades and a rota that put her watches back to back. She knew him from the king's own yard. The face grinding into the stone under her hand, the face of a man who'd come in the dark to open a door and let murder up a wall, war. Beneath the mask, the gray and iron colors of Thornhall, and belonged to one of Captain Renwick's own sworn guard. A wiser woman would have taken the wound on her ribs, as the warning it was, and found a reason, any reason, to be somewhere the king was not. Sorrel was, it was becoming clear, not an especially wise woman where this particular king was concerned. which was itself a discovery, because she'd have sworn on the road that wisdom was the only thing she had left. The guard she'd unmasked on the wall never came to trial. He was found dead in his cell the next morning. A sudden fever, the word passed round, or a bad heart, and not one soul in Thornhall who'd seen the timing of it believed a word. Healthy men do not take a chill and die in a single night the very hour they turn inconvenient. Someone had reached into the king's own dungeon and closed a mouth, and the reaching had been easy for them, and that told Sorrel more about what they were up against than a signed confession would have. This was not one bad soldier. This was something with roots, something patient, something that had been growing in the dark of Thornhall long enough to have a hand in every room. So they went carefully and slowly, and mostly at night, because the nights were the only hours the king could be a man tracing a poison rather than a king performing that he suspected nothing. And in those long, quiet hours, bent together over rosters and old paybooks, and the small treacheries of men who thought no one was counting, the thing between them that Sorrel had been refusing to name went on quietly naming itself. It was in the small things, the way these things always are. It was the second cup he started leaving at her elbow, without asking, because he'd learned she took it black. It was the way he stopped performing when the door shut, the coat coming off with the actual coat until it was just Torrin and the ledgers, and that still sharp attention she'd have crossed a room to be near and hated herself for it. It was the night she fell asleep over a paybook and woke with his cloak over her shoulders and him pretending unconvincingly to have noticed nothing. It was most of all the gray afternoon he found her in the empty yard at the frayed end of a watch, working a practice blade alone through the old forms her dead teachers had drilled into her bones. And instead of watching from a window like a sensible king, he shed his coat, took up a blade of his own and said, "Teach me the thing you did on the stairhead." She had meant to refuse. She found herself instead correcting the set of his shoulders with 2 fingers, and he went still under her hands the way he'd gone still over the ledger, and neither of them was thinking about the stairhead at all. He was better than he pretended, and worse than he needed to be, and when at last she put him flat on his back in the cold sand, gently, the way she'd spared the yard fighter, he only lay there laughing up at the iron sky, and did not get up, and looked at her standing over him, and she felt her own heart do something mutinous and unguardable. And understood she was in a kind of trouble no blade she owned had ever been forged to get her out of, and it was the questions. He asked them lightly, always, dropped into the middle of other things, but she was a woman who'd spent 3 years listening for the one wrong note in a friendly room, and she heard these land. Where had she learned the stairhead trick? Whether she'd ever served a house before Corvin's. What she remembered, this one, so gently she almost missed the weight of it, of 3 winters past, the bad one, the year the old king died. She turned every one of them, the way she turned everything, and gave him nothing, and every time she did, she caught something cross his face that was not suspicion. It looked, impossibly, like patience. It looked like a man waiting for her to arrive somewhere he'd already reached and was too kind to name aloud. And still, underneath the wanting, the guard in her kept its own cold count. She had not forgotten the wall, or the blade he'd carried in secret, or the unsurprised face over 3 downed men, or the 2 neat lines already written on her list. She watched him the way she'd watch a dark road she meant to cross, for the wrongness beneath the calm, for the thing he wasn't saying. That was the unbearable shape of it. She was falling for a man. She was also quietly investigating, and she could no longer say which of the 2 she was doing more honestly. A wiser woman would have chosen one. She had already established, to her considerable disgust, that she was not this week being a wiser woman. "You're doing it again," he said one night, not looking up from the page. "Doing what?" "Deciding what I am." He turned a leaf. "You've been deciding it since Blackpine. Careless king, clever king, dangerous king. You shuffle the deck every few days and deal yourself a new one." Now he did look up, and the gray eyes were quiet. "You could just ask me." "Asking gets a person lied to." "It does," he agreed easily, which was not the reassurance a liar gives. But you'd know. That's the thing about you, Sorrel. You always know. You knew those men on the wall were mine before I did. You know when Renwick's about to be stubborn, a full sentence before he opens his mouth. You read every room you've ever stood in down to the floorboards. He set the pen down. So read this one. Read me. And tell me what you find, because I would trust your read of me over my own. And that undid her more than any flattery could have. Because it wasn't flattery. It was a man handing her the one thing she was actually good at, and asking her to point it at him. She looked at him across the guttering candle, and felt the low rope pull tight, and, God's help her, felt the truth, crowding up her throat, 3 years of it, her name and her failure and the night she couldn't speak of, and the reason she walked toward every burning thing she passed. She opened her mouth. She was going to tell him. She had not told anyone anything true in 3 years, and she was, unbelievably, about to hand it all to a king over a candle. The door banged. Osric stood in it, gray-faced, a road-stained rider at his shoulder, and whatever he'd come to say died for one baffled instant as he took in the two of them, leaning close over the light, and then he found it again. "We've traced the coin," he said, "the money paying your dead men. We followed it back through 6 hands, and it stops in one place. Torrin, it stops on the Ironway." His eyes cut, just once, to Sorrel, and something in them, she couldn't read. It stops at Blackpine. They did not speak of it that night. That was the strange thing she'd remember after, that the world tilted, that Osric said Blackpine and the floor of everything she'd built shifted under her, and that Torrin looked at her across the ruin of it, and did the one thing no one had done in 3 years, which was to see that she'd been struck and choose, deliberately, not to press the wound. "Tomorrow," was all he said to Osric. "We'll take it apart tomorrow. All of it, not tonight." And Osric, who plainly had a great many urgent things to say and a rider's worth of them, looked at his king's face and then at the shields, and shut his mouth on every one and went. Blackpine. Corvin's Roadhouse. The one place, on the whole of the road, that had ever been kind to her, the man who'd hauled her half-dead out of a ditch and asked nothing, and the coin that paid for murder passed through his hands. There would be an answer for it. There was always an answer. A roadhouse on a trade road saw 1,000 purses, and couldn't be blamed for the black ones among them. She built the answer as she stood there and did not quite believe her own building. And the not believing was a cold, sick thing, because it stood too close to another thought she would not look at. "Hey!" Torrin's voice, low. He'd come around the table. He didn't touch her. "Wherever you just went, come back. You don't know what you found," she said. "You think you found a purse. You might have found the only person who was ever—" Her voice did something. It never did. She stopped it. "I know," he said. "Just that." And then, because he was who he was, he reached up slow enough that she could have stopped him a dozen times over and didn't, and put his hand against the side of her face, and the low rope under her ribs did not so much pull as sing, one clean, impossible note that went straight through her and out the far side. And she watched his eyes go wide, because she understood it in the same instant he did. He had felt it too, the same note, from the other end of the same rope. "That's not," she breathed. "No," he agreed, unsteady, wondering, his thumb moving once across her cheekbone. "It isn't nothing. It has never once, from the first moment I saw you cross that filthy floor, been nothing." For 3 years, she had told herself, the pull was tiredness, or the ordinary animal foolishness any woman might feel standing too near a thing that beautiful, and she had been lying. And she knew now that she had been lying, because a lie does not answer you when you finally stop telling it, and this had answered. He felt it. She felt him feel it. There was no version of the careful story she'd been telling herself since Blackpine that survived the wondering, undone look on his face. She should have stepped back. She was a woman, made entirely of the discipline required to step back. Instead, she turned her face into his hand, and that was the whole surrender, that one small motion, and he made a sound low in his chest, and closed the last of the distance, and kissed her, and every careful wall she'd spent 3 years mortaring went to water all at once. There was no strategy in it. That was the thing that wrecked her, the thing she'd have staked her life on afterward. Whatever else this man was, whatever secrets sat behind the gray eyes, there was nothing calculated in the way he kissed her, like a man who had been holding his breath for a year and was permitted, at last, to let it go. When her hand found the old ridged scar through his shirt, he did not flinch from it. He let her feel it, let her feel all of it. The king who let no one see anything, setting the whole performance down in the dark for her alone. The candle guttered, and neither of them cared. She had been wanted before for her sword, for her silence, for what her hands could do to keep others safe. She had never once in her life been wanted simply because she was herself, and it undid her. And for the length of that quiet hour, with the whole treacherous house asleep around them, she let herself be no one's weapon and no one's witness, only a person a good man was glad to hold. For one night, the rope between them was not a warning, but the only true thing in a house full of lies. They stayed there a long while in the dark and did not talk, which was its own small miracle for a man who used words the way Torrin did, as if silence were a wall he had to keep painting over before anyone saw through it. But he was quiet now, his hand moving slow through her hair, his heart under her ear gone even and unhurried at last. And Sorrel rested in the warm dark of a room she had no business being in, and felt the one thing she had walked away from every fire she ever passed. Not hidden, not furniture, safe. She knew better than any soul alive how well a house full of lies could counterfeit exactly this, and she let herself have it anyway, once, and despised how easily it came. She woke before dawn with his arm resting heavy and warm across her, and the rare, unfamiliar quiet of a body that had for a handful of hours stopped standing guard. She lay in it. She let herself, just for a moment, have it. Then the thin gray light found the table across the room, and the papers Osric's rider had left there, and the top sheet turned so she could read it upside down, an old muster roll, a list of names in a clerk's dead hand, and near the bottom, ringed twice in the king's own ink, a name she had not seen written in 3 years, and had prayed never to see again. Her own, her real one. The one she'd buried in a ditch outside Blackpine, the night Corvin found her. She was dressed and across the room with the paper in her hand before she decided to move, and the cold that went through her had nothing to do with the dawn. It was all there. Once she'd found the first sheet, she found the rest. And Torrin, waking to the sound of it, made no move to stop her, which was somehow worse than if he had. An old shield roll of the royal house. Her name on it, and beside it a second hand, his, noting survived, confirm. A sheaf on the hollow feast, the night 3 winters gone when the old king and half his blood were cut down at their own long table, and a girl's shield had fought until she could no longer stand, and then crawled away into the dark and out of the world. Sketches of a face, her face, younger, harder, and underneath all of it, in Torrin's cramped midnight hand, a single line that stopped her heart, the one who lived. Bring her in. She is the only witness left who saw the room. You knew, she said. Her voice came out very flat. In Blackpine, when you pushed back that hood and said, "There you are." She looked up, and the man in the bed she'd wept and shivered and come apart in was suddenly a stranger, wearing a king's face. You didn't find a marvel in a roadhouse. You found a witness you'd been hunting for 3 years. Gods. You weren't falling. You were closing a file. No. He was up now, and the ease was gone, and the thing that replaced it was the still sharp Torrin. The real one. The one she'd been fool enough to trust. Yes. Both Sorrel. She stepped back, and he stopped at once. The way he always did, and she hated that he knew to. The shield post, the ledgers. Read me, Sorrel. Tell me what you find. All of it. To keep the one living witness of the hollow feast close and softened and looking the other way until you needed her to point. You made me a tool. The same night, you made me a... She couldn't say it. The words sat in her mouth with nowhere kind to go. I brought you in because you were the only one alive who could name the men who killed my father, Torrin said, and his voice cracked straight down the center of the king and let the man show through. That is true, and I will not pretend it away. And it stopped being why by the 9th day. And that is also true, and you will not believe the second thing, because I let you find it like this. He gestured at the damning papers, at the wreck of the morning. Instead of telling you, and you would be right not to. I know it, Sorrel. Then why keep it? Because of what the roll doesn't say. He came no closer, but his eyes held her. The coin stops at Blackpine. The men who've tried 3 times to open me up stop at Blackpine. The one man on the whole of the Ironway who pulled a half-dead royal shield out of a ditch and hid her from the world for 3 years, and made very sure she never, ever went near a crown again. He said it as gently as a man has ever said a terrible thing. Sorrel, what if Corvin didn't save you? What if he kept you? The floor went out from under her a second time, and this fall was worse, because it had her whole life in it. For one breath she couldn't breathe at all. Then the breath came back, and it came back as fury. Because it was easier? Because it had to be? Because the alternative was a hole with no bottom. You don't get to do that, she said, shaking. You lied to me for a month and then you reached past it and put a knife in the one thing that was ever true. Corvin is the only person on this earth who never wanted anything from me. You don't know him. I know where the money stops. He runs a roadhouse, 1,000 purses a year. Sorrel. No, she threw the paper down between them. I believed you last night. That's the joke of it. Whatever this was, I believed it. And you let me. You took that, knowing I'd wake up and find this. She was at the door. She didn't remember crossing to it. Investigate your murder. Name your traitors. But you'll do it without me pointing, Majesty. Because I am done being the thing that people keep. Because I'm useful. That's not. His hand came up. Sorrel, please. There's a man on that road who has spent 3 years telling you what to think, and you're about to ride straight back to him, with your whole heart in your hands. And I can't. He caught himself, hauled it back into something quieter and worse. I'm not asking you to trust me. I've spent that. I'm asking you not to trust him, just until I have proof. That's all. And for one heartbeat, it almost reached her, because it had none of the smooth music of the month of lies behind it. It came out ragged and frightened and plain, the way only true things come out. She felt it pull. She very nearly turned. But turning meant letting the king who had used her be right about the one man who never had, and she was not strong enough, that gray morning, with the taste of him still on her mouth, and her whole small, hard-won life coming to pieces in her hands, to survive being that wrong about everything all at once. So she chose the wound she already knew how to carry over the one she didn't. But she was already gone, out into the gray corridor, with the dawn coming up cold, and the low rope under her ribs, pulled and pulled toward the road, toward Blackpine, toward the one man in all the world she was sure of, and she did not once let herself wonder why a rope she'd trusted her whole life had started. Somewhere back there in that ruined bright room, to feel less like a homing and more like a leash. Blackpine looked exactly as she'd left it, which felt like a lie the moment she saw it. The same sagged porch, the same door that didn't lock, the same warm gold light in the windows that had once meant the only safety she had in the world. Sorrel stood in the yard in the failing light, with 2 days hard riding in her spine, and understood that she had come here to be told she was wrong. She wanted it more than she'd wanted anything in 3 years. She wanted Corvin to laugh, to explain the purses, to put his big warm hands on her shoulders and make the king's careful papers turn back into what they should have been, which was a liar's clever poison. Corvin came out onto the porch before she'd tied the horse. He took one look at her face and his own, crumpled into that grief she'd never learned to read, and he came down the steps and folded her in, and for one moment, she let herself be held, and hated how much she needed it. "You went to that house," he said into her hair. "I told you not to go to that house. You told me a lot of things," she said, and drew back to look at him, and made herself say it. "There's coin, Corvin. Murder coin. Paying men to open the king up. It runs 6 deep and it stops here, at Blackpine. Tell me why." And she watched him. That was the thing she could not stop being even now, even here, a woman who read a face down to the bone. She watched the exact half instant, before his face arranged itself into shock. The way a very good player glances once at his cards, before he decides how to gasp, and something in her chest began, quietly and terribly, to fall. "So he's turned you," Corvin said, sorrowful, sitting her down on the step, as though she were 13 again. "Gods, girl, I feared this." A crown gets its hands on a person, and it makes them see traitors in the only ones who ever love them. "Listen to me, listen." And he told it beautifully. He told her the king was not what he seemed, that the young Alpha had bought his throne in blood, that the hollow feast 3 winters gone had not been Housevarn's doing at all, but Torrhen's own a spare son clearing the table of a father and a brother who stood between him and the crown. And that the assassination attempts she'd so bravely foiled were theater, a king painting himself a victim, so no one would look at the butcher underneath. "You were there," Corvin said, gripping her hands. "You're the only one left who is in that room. That's why he took you, don't you see? Not to honor you. To own the one witness who could hang him. And when the houses gather at Thornhall to weigh him, and they gather in 3 days, girl, your word is the only word that can save this whole kingdom, from the man who murdered his way to the top of it." It was very good. It was so good that for one long, swaying moment, she almost took it, because it fit the shape of the grief she'd carried 3 years, because it let her keep Corvin and lose the man who'd lied to her. And gods, that was the easier arithmetic. She'd have taken it. She was reaching for it. And then he made his one small mistake, the way even the best of them do, because a lie has too many corners to keep them all in the light at once. "I knew the moment I pulled you out of that ditch what you were," he said, warm, meaning it as love, a royal shield, half the life bled out of her. "I knew, and I kept you safe from all of it. Anyway, I knew what you were." The words went into her like cold water into a lung, because she had never told him. She had crawled out of the hollow feast with her name and her post, and everything she was locked behind her teeth, and she had washed up half dead on the Iron Way, a nameless nothing, and in 3 years she had never once, not drunk, not fevered, not weeping, told Corvin a single word of who she'd been. He could not have known she was the shield, from a body in a ditch. There was only one way to know a bled-out survivor, for a royal shield on sight, to already know a royal shield had bled and run from that particular room. To have been counting the bodies, to have needed to know which ones got up, and with that one wrong corner lit, the whole crooked house sprang into view at once. 3 years of it, every board. The suppers where he'd told her warm and certain over the stew, that the crown was rotten, and her old oaths so much wasted breath. The gentle, endless way he'd steered her off any road that ran toward Thornhall. The way he'd praised her for keeping her head down, for wanting nothing, for being no one, praised it, fed it to her as wisdom, as kindness, as a father's care, when it had only ever been a leash, paid out slack enough that she'd mistaken it for open country. He had not pulled a drowning woman from a ditch. He had found the one living witness who could hang him, and build her a life so small and so grateful that she would never once think to climb out of it and speak every kindness, a brick. And she had helped him lay every one and thanked him for the mortar. She kept her face still. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than the wall, harder than the feast, and she did it because 3 years of being furniture had taught her exactly how. She let her eyes fill, that part was not difficult, and she let her shoulders drop, and she said, in a voice she made small and broken, 3 days at Thornhall, and you want me to stand up before the houses and tell them what I saw? I want you to tell them the truth, Corvin said gently, and smiled, and she saw it now, plain as a mark on a coin, the thing under the warmth, that had been there her whole hidden life and that she had called safety, because she had needed a name for it, and safety was the one she could bear. All right, said Sorrel, the last living shield of the Hollow Feast, and let the man who had murdered her whole world believe he had loaded his weapon. I'll tell them what I saw. The great hall at Thornhall had not been so full since the old king's day, and every soul in it had come to watch a young alpha's reign, live or die. They ranged along its length in their house colors, the pack lords of Vielle, and their sworn ranks called to convocation, to weigh a rumor too large to ignore, that the king who sat their throne had bought it at the Hollow Feast with his own blood's blood. Torrin sat the high seat in black, and he wore the idle, careless coat she knew now for a coat, but underneath it, even from across the hall, she could see him holding himself like a man standing on a trapdoor listening for the bolt. Osric stood grey at his shoulder, and when Sorrel came in through the great doors with Corvin's hand at her back, she watched the king find her, watched his whole face open, one helpless instant, into hope she came, and then watched him see whose hand was steering her, and watched the hope go out like a snuffed wick. He thought she had come to bury him. Of course he did. She had given him every reason. Corvin played it to the rafters. He was magnificent. The plain, honest roadhouse keeper, come humbly before his betters, sick at heart to carry such news, and he laid the frame out board by board, the spare sun, the cleared table, the theatre of blood, and the houses leaned and murmured, and the murmur was not kind to the man in the high seat. But you need not take the word of a tavern keeper, Corvin said at last, and turned, and held out his hand to her, and the whole hall turned with him. There is one soul in all of Vielle who stood in that room and lived. The king's own shield. Ask her. She has no cause to love the crown and every cause to fear it. Ask her what she saw. His eyes met hers, warm, certain, the eyes that had tucked her in for 3 years. Tell their lordships who authored the Hollow Feast. Every face in the hall swung to her. The pack lords, House Varn's people, already half risen, already counting their victory. Osric, braced. And Torrin, who did not brace at all, who only looked at her across the vast cold room with a terrible open steadiness, a man who had decided he would take whatever she gave him and not flinch because he felt he had earned it. I'm sorry, she told him, with no words at all. I should have believed you sooner. I'm sorry it took me so long to read the one room that mattered. Then she turned to the houses of Vielle and said, clearly, so that it carried to the last cold corner of the hall, I'll tell you who authored it, but not the name this man wants you to hear. Corvin of Blackpine is lying to you, my lords, and I can prove it, and I am the only person alive who can. The hall cracked like ice. Corvin's face did not move. He was too good for that, but his hand, at his side, closed. I was the shield of the old king's blood, she said, and it was the first time in 3 years she had said it aloud, and it did not break her, it set her feet. I stood in that room. I know what the killers wore, and I know the mark they carried, and I never told one living soul either thing. Not the crown, not the road, not the man who says he pulled me from a ditch by chance. She turned back to Corvin. But you knew me for a shield on sight, 3 years ago. Half dead and nameless in the dark. You told me so 3 days past, on your own porch, thinking it a kindness. There is only one way to know which survivors to look for. Corvin. You have to already know who was meant to die. You weren't counting the living that night. You were counting the ones you'd missed. This is grief, Corvin said to the hall, spreading his hands, sorrowful. The poor creature is unwell. She's been got at. Search Blackpine, Sorrel said over him, to the pack lords, to the whole hall. Search House Varn's coffers against the king's coin trail that stops at Corvin's own door. You'll find the purses that paid the men on the wall. You'll find the mark those killers wore, 3 winters gone. Do it now, tonight, while every man who could empty those rooms is standing here in front of you and cannot reach them. Her chin came up. That is what a true witness costs you, my lords. Nothing but the trouble of looking. Then look, said the eldest of the pack lords, into the ringing silence. And it was done. She saw it land, saw the hall tip, saw Corvin understand in the same instant that the weapon he'd loaded had turned in his hand. He did what cornered things do. The grieving roadhouse keeper vanished off his face all at once, and what was left underneath was the architect, cold and fast, and the knife came out of his sleeve already moving, not toward the lords, not toward escape, but toward her, because she was the proof, and the proof had to die. Somewhere Torrin came out of the high seat with a shout torn raw out of him, but this one thing, out of the whole ruined tangle of her life, Sorrel knew exactly how to do. She did not think. She turned into the strike the way water turns a blade, caught the knife wrist, broke his balance over her hip, and put the man who had murdered her world face down on the cold stone of Thornhall with her knee in his spine and his own blade skittering away across the floor. She leaned down to his ear while the guards converged. "You told me the crown was too comfortable to think," she said very quietly, "just for him. You spent 3 years teaching me not to look too closely at anything, because the day I looked closely at you, this is what I'd find." She stood and let the guards take him, and did not watch them drag him out. And then the hall was cheering, and the houses were on their feet, and it was over. And across the wreck of it, Torrin was coming toward her, alive, cleared, his whole face undone, and Sorrel felt the low rope pull tight and true, and for the first time was not glad of it, because being right had not, it turned out, made her hurt any less. "You came for me," he said, reaching for her, "even after you still." "I came for the truth," she said, and stepped back out of his reach, and watched it land on him. "Corvin used me for 3 years, and you used me for 1. And the only difference between you is that you're the one I let in. I saved you because it was true, Torrin, not because it's forgiven." The rope pulled, and she made herself hold against it. "You should have told me. You let me stand in the dark, with a knife at my back, rather than trust me with the one thing that was mine. I don't know how to come back from that. I don't know if I want to try." She turned for the great doors, past the cheering houses, past Osric's stunned face, past everything. "Be a good king. You'll be a good king, but you'll do it without your shield." And she walked out of the brightest room in Vale, and did not look back, though the pull screamed the whole way, and let the great doors close, on the sound of a king calling her name. In the end, it took him the better part of a year, and he did it wrong the entire time, which was the only reason it worked at all. Sorrel did not go back to the road. She'd spent 3 years walking toward every fire she passed as penance, for a night that had never, it turned out, been her fault. And a woman who sets down a debt she never owed must learn some other way to walk. So she stayed in the low country, a hard day's ride from Thornhall, took on 2 half-wild orphan pups to train, and taught them everything her own dead teachers had once taught her. It was, to her considerable surprise, something very close to a life. Torrin left her alone. That was the part no one at court could fathom, least of all Osric, who had braced for a year of flowers and edicts and grand romantic sieges. None came, no summons, no gifts, no pleading letters heavy with crowns. He sent, instead, exactly one thing, in the first week, in his own cramped hand. "You were never a tool to me, and I'll not now make you a prize to be won. You are free, and Vielle owes its throne to you. I'll not spend that debt buying back the one thing, only worth having, freely given. If you never come, I'll understand. And I'll still be glad every day that you walked toward that room in Blackpine. Tea, and then nothing. For a year, nothing. The first time the maddening man had ever given her a door and not stood in it, and, she understood slowly, the most persuasive thing he could possibly have done. She thought about him constantly. She kept the rope closed, and hated it, and kept it closed. She told herself it was fading. It was not fading. It was near the turn of the year when Osric came up her lane, on a lathered horse, gray-faced, and her whole body went cold and ready, before he'd dismounted because she knew that face she'd worn it. The king, Osric got out, and her heart stopped clean. They got him, after all. House Varn's last knife. The king, he said, has lost what remains of his reason, and I've ridden 2 days to fetch the one person who might stop him making a spectacle of the crown, because he would not be talked out of it, and would not tell me why. Not dead. Her heart started again so hard it hurt. She heard the commotion before she reached her own gate, a crowd, the wrong sounds, for her quiet lane, the particular chaos of a great many people who do not know what to do. She came round the corner of the barn, with her hand already dropping to a hilt that wasn't there, braced for the worst, and stopped. There in the muddy yard of her small, ordinary holding, in front of half the gaping Low Country, stood the Alpha King of all Vale. No guard, no colors, no crown. He'd come alone into an unwarded yard a day's ride from anyone who could protect him. The most worth it thing in the kingdom. Standing undefended in the open like bait, like a fool, like a man who had decided the fastest way to reach the center of the danger was simply to walk toward it and be reached. The whole yard was telling him, no, he was not listening. His gray eyes had found her over every head between them, and his ruined, hopeful face broke open into something that hurt to look at. And he did the one thing that no law of Vale, no counselor of his court, and least of all his own Beta could ever afterward explain. He walked toward her. Straight through the chaos he'd made, across a filthy yard full of strangers, to the quiet woman at the edge of it, and Sorrel watched the Alpha King walk toward the center of the only thing worth running from, and understood that she had been on both ends of this rope from the very beginning, and that walking toward the fire had never been her penance. It had been her nature, and here, for once in her life, was someone walking it back. You closed the bond, he said, stopping close, breathing hard. A year, and you kept it shut, and I felt every day of it. But I woke this morning, and could not do 1 more hour of being sensible about you, Sorrel. So I've ridden here to make an enormous public fool of myself, and I find I don't care at all. His voice cracked. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking to spend the rest of my life earning the thing I should simply have told you. Open the bond, just once, just enough to know if there's a road back. And if there isn't, he swallowed, I'll go, and be glad you walk toward that room, every day, until I die. And Sorrel, last shield of the Hollow Feast, who had spent her whole life reading every room down to the floorboards, and had learned at terrible cost to trust the one reading she'd been most afraid of, looked at the undefended man standing in the wreck of his own dignity in her muddy yard. It hit them both at once. A year of it, held back and doubled and pouring through, all at the same time, and she heard him gasp, and felt her own eyes flood, and there was no mask in it, anywhere. On either end, nothing kept just the 2 plain true things they were, finally standing in the same open room with the door unbarred. There you are, she said. He laughed, and it broke, and he pulled her in, and the Low Country cheered a thing it would tell wrong for a generation. And Osric put his face in his hands and gave up, at last, on ever explaining any of it, which was, in the end, the correct response, because some things aren't meant to be explained. They're only meant to be walked toward.